Hey y'all, my name is Christian. I'm a millennial, and this is the Millennial Mind. Millennials get a bad rap for being lazy, non productive members of society. We also get told that our opinions are warped and don't matter. This podcast is designed to express a point of view on the world as a whole, but from a millennial's perspective. I will talk about love, current events, pretty much everything that comes to mind. Come join me on this journey on speaking my mind, and I would love for you to speak your mind as well. Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of the Millennial Mind. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey of speaking my mind. And I hope that all of you are speaking your mind as well. I hope that you all are enjoying this series on the Nobodies of Black history. I know that I am learning about individuals in Black history that weren't so mainstream. So we are going to continue our series. And I'm going to talk about a few more quote-unquote nobodies of Black history, and we'll go from there. So the first person that I want to talk about is Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was an entrepreneur and activist. She learned early in life how to run a business. She learned the basics of running a business. She also learned about the abolitionist movement. She married a wealthy free landowner named J.J. Smith, who was also an abolitionist, and that solidified her fortune and advanced her cause. Together, they worked to help slaves escape to the North and funded abolitionist causes. After Pleasant's husband died young, she headed west to San Francisco, which at the time was an almost lawless town. She worked as a cook and servant in rich people's homes until she was able to start her own boarding house, which will be the first of many. Pleasant was a familiar fixture in the houses of the wealthy during the period of the gold rush, as were the servants she began to train and place there. And it's said that she used the information she gained from her proximity to wealth to increase her own assets. She cannily invested her money and soon amassed a startling personal fortune based on stocks, real estate, and a series of businesses, including laundries and food establishments, that made her one of the growing city's major entrepreneurs. At her peak, she was estimated to be worth $30 million, an astonishing sum for the period. As Pleasant became a powerful woman, she continued her work for civil rights, often in the courts. Shortly after the Civil War, she sued one streetcar company for not allowing blacks on their line and sued another that permitted segregation. She won both cases. She became known in the Black community for her philanthropy and very public support for civil rights, which was unusual for a woman and doubly unusual for a woman of color. She used her money to defend wronged blacks and spent thousands in legal fees, becoming a hero to a generation of African Americans in California. Unfortunately, Pleasant's later life was tough. She supported the case of a woman engaged in a marriage dispute with a senator from Nevada, which hurt her financially and politically when the woman lost. The death of her financial partner, Thomas Bell, threw her affairs into turmoil, and his widow challenged Pleasant's right to most of her holdings. Yellow journalists branded her Mammy Pleasant, accusing her of everything from murdering Thomas Bell to putting entire households under voodoo spells. Pleasant's vast fortune was lost, and she died in poverty in 1904. Fortunately, her sullied reputation as Mammy has not defined her life. Today, she is more commonly remembered as the mother of civil rights in California. So that just shows that even if you do have obstacles in your life, what the main thing as far as what you should look or work towards is your character and your reputation. And you can see that even though her life was a little bit tough towards the end, her reputation preceded her. And she was still known as the mother of civil rights in California, which is an amazing title to have. Another person that I want to talk about is Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman was born in a one-room shack in Texas in 1892. An intelligent young girl, she attended school faithfully and was active in her Baptist church. That is, when she was not needed in the cotton fields to help her large family survive. There were 13 children altogether. She worked as a laundress to save money to attend college in Oklahoma, but her money ran out after only one semester. Hoping for better things, she moved north to Chicago to stay with her older brother. Although she found life there difficult, with her work as a manicurist neither lucrative or fulfilling, she overheard and was entranced by the stories of pilots who had recently returned from the airfields of World War I. She made up her mind to be a pilot. In 1918, except for the occasional wealthy socialite, female pilots were rare and African American female pilots were non-existent. Coleman was stonewalled by sexism and racism from American pilots who scoffed at her desire to fly. Hearing of her woes, black newspaperman Robert Abbott, the publisher of the Chicago Defender, encouraged her to go to France to learn how to fly. He financed a trip to Paris in 1920, and for 7 months, Coleman trained with some of the best pilots in Europe. Despite being the only black person in her class, she was treated with respect and earned her international pilot's license by 1921. When she returned to America, newspapers caught wind of the unusual story, and she became a minor celebrity almost overnight. In the early 1920s, commercial aviation was still in its infancy, so most active flyers were stunt flyers who performed at air shows. Coleman sought out the best in the field, again in Europe, for training, and she took to the air show circuit, where she was a big hit. Nicknamed Queen Bess, Coleman was known for her daredevil aerial tricks, and her race and her gender became a selling point instead of a liability. For 5 years, she barnstormed around the country, making a good living. It was a hard living, however filled with risks. In 1923, for instance, she ended up in the hospital with a broken leg when her plane crashed from mechanical failure. A later, more serious mechanical failure would lead to Coleman's premature demise in 1926. She purchased a replacement plane for the one she lost in 1923, and her co-pilot, a man named William D. Wills, flew the crate from Texas to Florida, the location of the next air show. The plane had mechanical problems during the journey and was in desperate need of an overhaul, but Wills and Coleman unwisely took it up on April 30th to survey the ground for the parachute jump that Coleman planned for the next day. The plane failed once again, but this time it could not be piloted safely to the ground. Wills was killed on impact, and Coleman, who had not been wearing a seatbelt so she could look at the landscape over the side of the plane, was pitched from her seat and died instantly. Coleman had hoped to inspire other young African Americans to take to the skies by establishing a flight school. Her dream to start a school would never be realized, but by being the first Black American woman to fly, she inspired countless young men and women to do the same. So thank you, Miss Coleman, um, for her contribution to aviation, because you don't hear too many African Americans, let alone African American women, that are aviators. So for her to be the first African American woman to fly was huge. Okay, we're just going to take a short break and then we will be back to discuss a couple other people. This podcast is sponsored by Anchor. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your phone or computer. Creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere, even on platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Download the Anchor app today or go to anchor.fm to get started. Once again, you can download the Anchor app, that's ANCHOR, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hey y'all, welcome back. I'll get right back into it about discussing the Nobodies of Black history. Another person that made his own contribution to Black history was Matthew Henson. Matthew Henson was born in Maryland just after the Civil War and had a hard-luck childhood. Both of his parents died when he was a boy, and Henson lived with an uncle in Washington, D.C. before striking out on his own at the age of 11. He traveled by foot to Baltimore, where he hoped he could get work on a ship. He succeeded, and he became a cabin boy on a freighter. He saw the world, China, Europe, North Africa, and learned how to read and write thanks to the ship's kindly captain, who saw that the young boy was bright and eager to learn. After 6 years of sailing the ocean, Henson's captain died. Grieving for the man who had done so much for him, Henson returned to Washington and took a job as a store clerk in a furrier's shop. It was at the store that Henson met Navy Lieutenant Robert Edwin Peary, who was selling some pelts, and took a shine to the young man as they discussed their various adventures. Peary gave him a job as his assistant on an upcoming survey trip of Nicaragua. Henson, missing the adventure of travel, soon became a permanent member of Peary's crew. When Peary announced plans to reach the top of Greenland in 1891, Henson happily joined the officer on his journey. Through the 1890s, Peary and his team would return to Greenland several times, battling extreme weather, loss of team members, and starvation to achieve their goal. On one journey, they were forced to eat the dogs pulling their sleds. Peary grew to count on Henson, whose carpentry, mechanical, and dog driving skills were second to none. By the turn of the century, Peary had become determined to reach the North Pole. Over the next several years, Peary, always with Henson at his side, would make attempt after attempt, each one unsuccessful due to the harshness of the conditions. In 1908, they decided to make one final attempt since time was running against them. Peary was 50, Henson was 40. Previous attempts had been hampered by difficult communication with the native Eskimos. Henson learned their language so he could talk to them, the only member of the team to do so. By gaining the Eskimos' confidence and trust, Henson paved the way for the success of the expedition, as did a special ice-cutting boat built especially for the expedition. Henson actually arrived closest to the pole in advance of Peary, but it was Peary himself who trudged the last few miles to plant the American flag. Peary seemed to resent Henson for arriving ahead of him, and Their relations on the return trip were strained and never quite the same afterward. Commander Peary, of course, was celebrated for his achievement upon his return to America. Although Henson had technically gotten there first, he did not receive the same attention, and in short order, he had to find new work. He ended up parking cars in New York. Fortunately, friends lobbied on his behalf, and Henson's fortunes began to change. He received a civil service appointment from President Taft that gave him a more comfortable living. He published an autobiography in 1912, and the subsequent biography made Henson's role in the North Pole expeditions more widely known. He received a Congressional Medal in 1944 and the Presidential Citation in 1950. By the time he died in 1955, Matthew Henson could rest easy, having been recognized as the co-founder of the North Pole. First of all, this is amazing because, first off, I didn't even know that the Eskimos had their own native language, and for Mr. Henson to take time to actually learn the language so that he could relate to the people was fantastic, and not a story that you hear a lot. And for him not to be initially recognized for his achievement and not only identifying with these people, but also being one of the first people to make it on the North Pole was unsettling, but unfortunately it's something that happens quite often to our African American people. But nevertheless, later on in his life, he was recognized for his achievements, which, that's something that African Americans want. They want to be recognized. So I think I may read up on his autobiography and biography because this is very interesting, to have an African American Eskimo, so to speak, who made it to the North Pole. That's a story you don't hear all the time. So thank God for Mr. Henson, or else we wouldn't know anything about the North Pole. And last but not least, you guys know that I am an attorney, so I like to find individuals who are in the legal field. So we have William H. Hastie. He was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1904, and like Coleman or Brown, he showed precocious intelligence and an early determination to succeed. His parents, a government clerk and a teacher, were in a better position than most to help their son excel, and he attended Amherst College in Massachusetts, where he graduated at the top of his class. Inspired by his cousin Charles Houston, who had a position at the Howard University School of Law, Hastie decided to enroll in law school. After an exceptional academic career, he passed the bar exam and became a practicing lawyer and a teacher at Howard. In 1933, he returned to Harvard to obtain his doctorate in judicial studies. It was at this point that the new administration of President Roosevelt took notice of the young man, who now called Washington, D.C. his home. He was one of the first African Americans appointed by the administration, serving as a lawyer with the Department of the Interior. As part of his work there, he drafted a constitution for the Virgin Islands, which had become an American territory after World War I. Taking note of his work, Roosevelt appointed Hastie to the federal court in the Virgin Islands, effectively making him the first federal African American judge in history. He wouldn't stay very long, however, because of the outbreak of World War II. Hastie left for a job in the War Department, where he hoped to promote the integration of training units. Unfortunately, his attempts to do so were frustrated, and the idea would not take hold until after he had moved on. Hastie's outspokenness, however, had much to do with spurring public debate on the subject. Hastie returned to the Virgin Islands when Congress passed an act assigning a governor to the region. which until that point had been loosely governed by the Department of the Interior and the military. Roosevelt appointed Hasty to be that first governor, making him the very first black governor of a U.S. state or territory to serve a full term. Back in 1872, Pinckney Pinchbeck had served 35 days when the governor of Louisiana was impeached, making him technically the first African American governor in history, but his service was a stopgap measure. Hasty's first love remained the law, however, and he returned to the mainland in 1949 to accept President Harry Truman's nomination of him to the Federal Court of Appeals. Although there was resistance to his nomination in the Senate, which took 6 months to confirm him, Truman's support carried the day, and Hasty became a federal judge in 1950. He will hold the position until his retirement in 1971. As the highest-ranking black federal judge, Hasty was able to speak openly about racism and segregation and support decisions that combated them. Of course, he also addressed innumerable cases that had nothing to do with race, and he became one of the most respected members of the bench. It seemed likely for a time that he would be nominated for the Supreme Court, but although this nomination never came to pass, Hasty left behind a record of public service that few could better. After retirement, Hasty became an activist for black causes and a lawyer for public interest groups until his death in 1976. Okay, so there's like so much meat in here. Hasty, not only was he very intelligent, but he broke a lot of barriers, being the first African American federal judge to being the first African American governor of a U.S. state or territory to serve a full term is amazing. And to be recognized by presidents for the work that he did was huge. And this is another person that I'm actually going to look more into because it seemed like he was a very powerful person and very determined to succeed, and his success, it shows. So are there any other quote unquote nobodies of Black history that you would like for me to talk about? Make sure that you email me at mindofmillennials@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment on our Facebook page, The Millennial Mind. Make sure to catch previous episodes of our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify, and Anchor. And before we go, of course, I always have a quote for you all, and this comes from Booker T. Washington. He says, "Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed." Great words by Booker T. Washington. Well, until next week, I will see you guys soon.